The fluorescent lights hummed with a frequency that had burrowed into my spine somewhere around my third week. My name is David Castellano, and I was 41 years old when I accepted the position at Westbrook Logistics in Portland, Oregon. A decision I made not out of desperation, but out of a kind of deliberate self-erasure, the sort of professional move you make when you've decided that invisibility is preferable to the alternative. The alternative, in my case, was being seen. I had spent the previous 6 years as a regional sales manager for an industrial equipment distributor. That job had required the kind of visibility I'd grown to resent. Presentations to clients, performance metrics displayed on corporate dashboards, networking events where conversations evolved into performance reviews conducted in real time. I was good at it. That was the problem. Being good at something visible meant being responsible for it, and responsibility had become a weight I no longer wanted to carry. So I'd resigned, without another position lined up, which was the kind of decision that suggested either financial security or emotional instability, depending on who was evaluating it. What I actually possessed was a modest inheritance from my mother, who had died 3 years earlier. The money wasn't vast, roughly $240,000, but it was enough to support a deliberate downward mobility. I could afford to disappear into work that didn't require me to be noticed, work that existed at the margins of corporate attention, work that would allow me to think about things other than performance optimization and client satisfaction matrices. Westbrook Logistics occupied a sprawling industrial complex on the eastern edge of Portland, a facility that had been constructed in 1987 and had been gradually expanded and repurposed through successive waves of corporate acquisition. The building was a kind of palimpsest of different companies and different eras, each layer visible in the architectural choices and the equipment that remained from previous operations. The loading dock, the reason the company had issued the specific warning about opening it alone, was one of these archaeological remnants, a massive structure attached to the northeast corner of the facility that had originally been designed for a different kind of logistics operation entirely. I worked in receiving, which meant my primary responsibility was managing the intake of shipments, verifying manifest documentation, and coordinating with warehouse staff to ensure proper storage and categorization. It was methodical work, the kind of work that could be performed with minimal human interaction if you were efficient enough. I had always been efficient. The job paid $22 per hour with benefits, which meant that even with careful spending, I could extend my mother's money indefinitely, perhaps for the rest of my life if I continued to avoid the kinds of expenses that most people accumulated without thinking about them. On my first day, my supervisor, a woman named Patricia, who was in her mid-50s and who carried the particular exhaustion of someone who had been working in logistics for longer than most people spend in their entire careers, took me through the facility's basic operations. She showed me the receiving area, the inventory management system, the break room, the protocol for handling hazardous materials, the locations of the fire extinguishers, and the emergency exits. All of this was standard orientation material, the kind of thing I'd been through a dozen times in different facilities across different companies. Then we approached the loading dock. "This is the north dock," Patricia said, gesturing toward a massive steel door that was, I estimated, at least 20 feet wide and 16 feet tall. The door was painted an institutional gray, and the surrounding wall was made of reinforced concrete that had been patched and repatched over the decades, creating a patchwork of different shades of gray. "We don't use this anymore. It's part of the original facility design, but it's been effectively sealed off since the consolidation in 2009. I looked at the door. It had a standard industrial handle, lever style, the kind you'd find on any large mechanical door. There was a keypad next to it with a black screen and numbered buttons. The screen was dark. "Why is it still here?" I asked. It seemed like the kind of thing a company would remove if it wasn't being used. Structural integrity, Patricia said. The north wall is load-bearing. Removing the door frame would require significant reinforcement of the surrounding structure. It would cost more to take it out than to just leave it sealed. She paused, and I noticed a subtle shift in her expression, something that suggested she was about to deliver information that carried weight beyond its literal content. The company policy is explicit. No one opens this dock alone. If you need to access it for any reason, which I'll be honest, you almost certainly won't, you need at least 2 other people present. Ideally, you'd call management first. Why? I asked. Structural instability, Patricia said. The door mechanism is old. The hydraulic system that controls the opening and closing has been replaced multiple times, but the foundational systems are original. If the door opens and there's a pressure imbalance or a mechanical failure, it can cause the frame to shift. We don't want anyone alone when that happens. This explanation was delivered in a tone of complete professional normalcy, the kind of tone you'd use to explain any standard workplace safety protocol. But I had been paying attention to Patricia's face, and I had noticed that her eyes had glanced toward the door for just a fraction of a second longer than the explanation would have warranted. It was a micro-expression, the kind of thing most people wouldn't consciously register. But I had spent 6 years in sales, which meant I had spent 6 years learning to read the tiny deviations between what people said and what they actually believed. Patricia did not believe that explanation. Or rather, she believed part of it. The structural components were probably accurate, but there was something else, something she wasn't telling me. And the fact that she was withholding information wasn't unusual in a workplace context. People withheld information all the time, usually for reasons that were reasonable, to avoid causing unnecessary concern, to maintain operational efficiency, to preserve institutional authority. What made this different was that the withholding felt deliberate in a way that suggested the withheld information was important. I didn't ask her to elaborate. I had learned over the course of my sales career and my subsequent decision to abandon that career that direct questions about obvious gaps in explanations created discomfort for the people providing those explanations, and that discomfort often made them defensive in ways that were counterproductive. Instead, I nodded, acknowledged the safety protocol, and filed away the moment as data. My first 3 months at Westbrook were uneventful in a way that felt almost therapeutic. I arrived at 7 a.m., performed my receiving duties, took a 30-minute lunch break that I ate alone in my car, and left at 3:30 p.m. The work was repetitive and required just enough attention to prevent my mind from wandering into the kinds of introspective territories that had led me to abandon my previous career in the first place. I had discovered, perhaps unsurprisingly, that the same brain that was capable of sophisticated sales analysis was also capable of creating elaborate narratives about personal inadequacy and existential purposelessness if given sufficient unstructured time. The receiving department consisted of 3 people: myself, a man named Gordon who had worked at Westbrook for 14 years, and who had a kind of institutional knowledge that made him valuable despite his relative lack of ambition, and a younger woman named Keisha who was using the job as temporary employment while she completed an online degree in business management. The 3 of us worked in relative harmony, dividing the labor according to a system that had evolved organically over time. I handled the documentation and the inventory system management. Gordon managed the physical receiving and the coordination with the warehouse staff, and Keisha handled the administrative follow-up and the communication with clients regarding shipment status. It was during my 4th month that I first became aware of something unusual about the north loading dock. I was working late one evening. We had received a large shipment that required extended documentation, and I had volunteered to stay beyond my regular hours to ensure that the backlog wouldn't create problems for the following day. The facility at 6 p.m. had a particular quality to it. The main operations had largely ceased, but the building itself was still alive in a minimal way. The HVAC system was still running, creating a constant low hum. The emergency lighting remained active, casting the corridors in a kind of sodium vapor amber that made everything look faintly diseased. And there was something else. Something that I noticed only because I was paying attention in that particular way that comes with being alone in a large building. There was a vibration. It was subtle, the kind of thing you might not notice if you weren't standing still and paying close attention to your physical environment. But it was there, a low-frequency oscillation that seemed to be emanating from the direction of the north wall. I was in the receiving area, which was located roughly 30 feet from the loading dock door, and the vibration was just barely perceptible through the concrete floor and the soles of my shoes. I stood there for a moment, trying to determine whether the vibration was actually present or whether I was experiencing a kind of phantom sensation, the result of my brain attempting to create patterns from background noise. But the more I focused on it, the more certain I became that something was actually vibrating. Something behind the north wall. Something with a regular, almost mechanical rhythm. I walked toward the loading dock door. The vibration became more pronounced as I approached. By the time I was standing in front of the door, I could feel it clearly. A persistent, low-frequency pulse that seemed to be coming from the far side of the metal barrier. I placed my hand against the door and I could feel the vibration transmitted through the steel, a subtle thrumming that was almost rhythmic. Then it stopped. The moment my hand made contact with the door, the vibration ceased. I waited, my hand still against the cold metal, but nothing happened. The vibration didn't resume. The building fell silent, except for the omnipresent hum of the HVAC system. I pulled my hand away from the door and walked back to my workstation. I told myself that the vibration had probably been caused by something routine. A truck passing on the street outside, a shift in the building's mechanical systems, some kind of equipment in an adjacent facility. The fact that it had stopped when I touched the door was probably coincidental. My brain imposing a causal relationship on two events that were unrelated. But I found myself thinking about Patricia's explanation of why the north dock couldn't be opened alone, and I found myself noticing that the explanation still didn't quite make sense. Structural instability caused by a pressure imbalance seemed like the kind of thing that would be documented in maintenance records, reported to OSHA, possibly resulting in the facility being cited for safety violations. And yet there had been no indication of any such issues. The north dock had simply been left there, sealed, with a rule about not opening it alone that was presented as routine safety protocol, but that carried a weight that suggested something more than mere structural concern. Over the following weeks, I began to develop a routine that was, in retrospect, almost obsessive in its precision. I would stay late at the facility, ostensibly to complete documentation work, but actually to be present in the building during the hours when it was largely empty. And during those hours, I would make my way to the north loading dock door, place my hand against it, and wait. The vibration returned irregularly, sometimes after I had been standing there for several minutes, sometimes not at all. When it did return, it had the same quality. Low frequency, rhythmic, almost deliberate in its regularity. And it would stop the moment I made contact with the door, as if whatever was producing the vibration was aware of my presence and was responding to it by ceasing the vibration. I began to wonder if the vibration was actually coming from beyond the door, or if it was somehow being produced by the door itself, by some kind of mechanical system that was integrated into the door's structure. I examined the door more carefully, looking for any obvious mechanical components that might be the source of the vibration. But the door appeared to be solid, its surface unmarked except for the weathering that came with age and exposure to the industrial environment. One evening in my 5th month, I made the decision to open the door. I want to be clear about my mental state at this point. I was not desperate, and I was not being driven by the kind of curiosity that manifests as compulsive behavior. What I was experiencing was something more subtle and more difficult to articulate. A sense that there was information available to me, information that was being deliberately withheld, and that understanding the nature of that information was somehow important to understanding who I was and what I wanted to become. This is the kind of rationalization that sounds absurd when articulated directly, and I'm aware of that. But I had spent 6 years performing the role of someone who understood what he wanted, and I had become very good at creating narratives that justified my choices. What I hadn't done, until recently, was step back from that performative structure and examine what was actually driving me. And what was driving me, I suspected, was something that had little to do with the loading dock and everything to do with a kind of hunger for experiences that couldn't be commodified or optimized or turned into performance metrics. The company had told me never to open the loading dock alone. This was presented as a safety concern, but what it actually represented was a boundary, a line that I had been told not to cross. And boundaries, I had come to understand, are often more about managing institutional liability and maintaining social hierarchies than they are about actual safety concerns. I came to work on a Friday at 7 a.m. as usual. Gordon and Keisha were both present, and we went through our normal routines. But I had made the decision at some point in the preceding weeks that I would stay late that evening, wait for everyone else to leave, and then I would open the north loading dock door. At 3:30 p.m., I told Patricia that I needed to complete some additional documentation work and that I would be staying for another 2 hours. She nodded without asking for specifics. She was accustomed to me staying late. It was part of the routine I had established. By 5:45 p.m., the facility had cleared out. The main operations had ceased. The receiving area was empty except for me. The HVAC system hummed its constant hum. The emergency lighting cast everything in that faintly diseased amber color. I walked to the north loading dock door. I could already feel the vibration starting, that low-frequency pulse that seemed to emanate from beyond the barrier. I stood in front of the door for several minutes, my hand resting against its cold surface, feeling that pulse transfer itself into my palm. Then I approached the keypad. The keypad had a black screen and numbered buttons, 0 through 9, plus asterisk and pound sign. There was no indication of what code, if any, would activate the door. I stood there, looking at the keypad, and I realized that I had never actually investigated what code might be required. I had assumed, I think, that the door would simply open if I pulled the handle, that the ceiling Patricia had described was more metaphorical than literal. But of course it wasn't. Of course the door would be locked. This was an industrial facility. Everything was locked. Access was controlled. I tried the handle anyway. It didn't move. The door was locked. I stood there in front of the keypad, and I felt something shift in my mental state, something that resembled disappointment, but that was also something else, something that suggested I had been confronting a boundary that I had told myself I was willing to cross, and that the boundary had turned out to be more substantial than I had wanted it to be. Then I remembered something. I remembered that Patricia had mentioned the keypad in her orientation, that she had mentioned it in the context of explaining that the door was sealed, that it was no longer in use. And I remembered that she had not said the keypad was non-functional. She had simply said that the door was sealed. I tried a standard industrial facility access code, 1111. Nothing happened. The screen remained dark. I tried 0000. Nothing. I tried 1234. The screen flickered, and I heard a sound from the door, a kind of mechanical whirring that suggested something internal had engaged. The keypad screen illuminated, displaying 4 asterisks, indicating that the code had been accepted and was waiting for confirmation. I pressed the pound sign. The mechanical whirring continued, but it became more complex, incorporating different frequencies and rhythms. The door shuttered, and I stepped back, suddenly uncertain about whether I actually wanted this to proceed. The mechanical sounds coming from the door were not the sounds of a well-maintained system. They were sounds that suggested stress and strain, the sounds of machinery being asked to perform a function that it had not been asked to perform in a very long time. Then the door began to open. The hydraulic system engaged, and the massive steel panel started to rise slowly, its movement jerky and uneven. As it rose, cold air began to pour from the opening beneath it, air that smelled like something old and stale, air that carried with it a faint chemical odor that I couldn't immediately identify. The door continued to rise, and I could now see what lay beyond it. It was a space. That's the only way I can describe it, and I'm aware of how inadequate that description is. It was a space that was not quite consistent with the architecture of the facility as I understood it. The loading dock, according to the facility's layout, opened directly onto the exterior, a loading area that had been designed for trucks to back up to the dock and receive cargo. But what I was seeing beyond the opening door was not an exterior loading area. It was an interior space, a vast room that extended backward into the facility, a space that should not have existed based on the dimensions of the building as they had been explained to me. The space was dimly lit by a kind of sourceless illumination, a glow that seemed to come from the air itself rather than from any particular light fixture. The color of that glow was a pale blue, the kind of color that evoked fluorescence without actually being fluorescent. And in that pale blue light, I could see that the space was filled with objects. I couldn't determine, from my vantage point at the loading dock door, what those objects were. They appeared to be large structures, but their dimensions and configurations were not immediately clear. They seemed to be arranged in some kind of pattern, rows or columns, but the perspective created by the lighting and the distance made it difficult to understand the exact nature of that arrangement. The door had now risen approximately 12 feet, enough that I could step through the opening if I wanted to. The cold air continued to pour out, and the chemical smell was stronger now, more identifiable. It smelled like formaldehyde, or something similar to formaldehyde, a preservative chemical of some kind. I should not have stepped through that opening. I'm aware of that now. I'm aware that stepping through that opening was the kind of boundary crossing that could not be easily undone. That once I entered that space, something fundamental about my relationship to the facility, to the company, and to my own choices would change. But I did step through. I did cross that boundary. The moment my body passed through the plane of the opening, the door began to close. I heard the hydraulic system engage again, and I turned to see the massive steel panel descending. I should have rushed back through the opening. I should have prevented the door from closing. But instead, I simply stood there and watched it descend, watching the connection to the known world contract and finally seal itself off. The door sealed with a soft hydraulic hiss, and I was alone in the pale blue space. I stood there for what might have been seconds or might have been minutes. Time felt unreliable in that space, a unit of measurement that didn't quite apply to what was happening. I was breathing. I was aware of that. My heart was beating faster than usual. My hands were trembling slightly, but my mind felt strangely calm, as if some part of me had understood, before my conscious self had fully processed it, that I had arrived at a destination that I had been traveling toward for a very long time. Then I began to walk deeper into the space. The objects that had appeared to be structures from a distance resolved themselves as I approached into something more specific and more disturbing. They were tanks, large glass or acrylic containers, each one approximately 10 feet tall and perhaps 6 feet in diameter. The containers were arranged in precise rows, extending backward into the space as far as I could see. And within each container was liquid, a pale amber-colored liquid, and within that liquid was a figure. Each tank contained a human figure, suspended in the amber liquid, the figure's body in a position of perfect stillness, its features preserved in a state of neither life nor death. I approached the nearest tank and looked into it, and I saw a man, approximately middle-aged, with his eyes closed and his arms at his sides. The features of the face were undamaged, unmarked by decay or deterioration. The figure appeared to be in perfect preservation, as if time itself had stopped around this particular body. I moved to the next tank, and I saw a woman, younger, perhaps in her 20s or 30s, with her hair suspended in the liquid around her head in a kind of halo. Her expression was peaceful, almost serene. I began to walk down the row of tanks, and I understood, with a certainty that bypassed any rational analysis, that what I was looking at was a collection. Not a collection in the sense of accumulated objects, but a collection in the sense of curation, a deliberately assembled group of human bodies, each one preserved with meticulous care, each one selected according to some criterion that I did not yet understand. The row extended for what must have been several hundred feet, and I could see in the distance, where the rows continued, branching off in different directions, creating a kind of labyrinth of tanks and preserved bodies. And as I walked, I became aware of something else, something that took me several minutes to fully process. The bodies looked familiar. Not all of them, not immediately, but as I walked and as my brain began to make connections, I realized that I was recognizing some of the faces. Not recognizing them in the sense of having known these people personally, but recognizing them in the sense of having seen them before, having processed their images at some point in my life. I saw a face that I recognized from a missing persons poster, a woman who had disappeared from Portland 3 years ago. I saw another face that I recognized from a news report, a person who had been presumed dead in a hiking accident in the Columbia River Gorge. The more I walked, the more I recognized, and the more I understood that what I was looking at was not some kind of illegal medical experiment or scientific research project, but something else entirely, something that suggested a level of deliberation and control that went far beyond what any individual or even any organization could reasonably maintain. I walked for what must have been nearly an hour, moving through the rows of tanks, understanding with increasing certainty that I was no longer in the industrial facility in Portland, Oregon. The space I was in was far too vast, far too complex, for it to be contained within the structure I had entered through. Something about the geometry of the space was wrong, in a way that suggested that the normal rules of spatial relationship had been suspended or altered. And then I saw something that caused me to stop walking. One of the tanks was empty. It was positioned in the middle of one of the rows, distinguished from the others only by the absence of a body, the absence of the amber liquid, the absence of the sense of preservation and curation that characterized all the other containers. The glass of the empty tank was clear and undamaged, and it was obvious that the tank had been designed with the intention of containing something, but that whatever it had contained had been removed. I approached the empty tank, and I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. On the side of the tank there was a name, etched into a small metal plate. David Castellano. I stood in front of that tank for a very long time. I was not afraid, which was strange because I understood at some level what the existence of that tank meant. I understood that I had been selected, that I had been identified, that my presence in this space was not accidental. I understood that the vibration I had felt emanating from beyond the loading dock door was some kind of signal, some kind of mechanism designed to draw me toward this space, to motivate me to cross the boundary that I had been told not to cross. And I understood that the boundary had not been designed to keep me out. It had been designed to draw me in. I sat down on the floor in front of the empty tank, and I waited. I didn't know what I was waiting for, but I understood that waiting was the appropriate response, that something was going to happen, some kind of completion or resolution to the sequence of events that had led me to this moment. And after a time, I heard a sound, a footstep, deliberately placed to indicate that I was no longer alone. I turned and I saw a figure approaching from deeper within the space. A figure that was human in form, but that moved with a kind of precision that suggested something more than human agency, something that was using a human body as a kind of vehicle or instrument. "You're wondering why you're here," the figure said. Its voice was a man's voice, but it had a quality to it that was difficult to describe, a kind of harmonic layering that suggested it was being produced by something that was not entirely human. "You're wondering how you were selected, how you were identified, how someone or something knew to draw you here." "Yes," I said. My voice sounded normal, which was strange, because nothing about the situation was normal. "The answer is simple," the figure said. "You were never hiding. You thought you were, but you weren't. When you left your job, when you decided to make yourself invisible, when you started searching for boundaries to cross and rules to break, you were making yourself visible to us. You were announcing yourself as someone who was ready for this, someone who was ready to stop playing a role and start being something real." "What am I?" I asked. "Look at the tanks around you," the figure said. "What do you see?" "People," I said. "Preserved people." "You see preservation," the figure said. "We see potential. Every person in this space was selected because they contained something that others around them lacked. A kind of authenticity, a kind of refusal to accept the systems that were designed to contain them. And they were preserved so that that quality could be extracted and maintained, so that it could be used to identify others, to call them toward this place. Fia. "I don't understand," I said. "The vibration you felt," the figure said. "That was a signal produced by the preserved consciousness of the person whose name is on that tank. Your tank. You were already here, David. You were here in this space, preserved and conscious and broadcasting a signal across the distance, calling yourself toward the moment when you would arrive. You were calling yourself home." I looked at the empty tank, and I understood what the figure was telling me. I understood that at some point in my life, perhaps in the future, perhaps in the past, perhaps in some kind of temporal loop that I didn't fully comprehend, I had been brought to this place, had been placed in that tank, had been preserved. And I understood that the body I was currently inhabiting, the body that had walked through the loading dock door, was not my original body. It was a replacement, a vessel that had been constructed or obtained or prepared for the purpose of allowing me to experience the process of choosing to come to this place, of experiencing the boundary crossing in real time. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," the figure said, "you can choose. You can accept what you are and what you're becoming, and you can join the others in preservation. Your consciousness will be maintained in perfect clarity, perfect preservation, able to send signals across the distance to other iterations of yourself, helping them to find their way here. Or you can reject this. You can choose to return to the facility in Portland, to the world as you understood it, to your job and your carefully constructed invisibility. But if you choose that, you'll never stop hearing the signal. You'll never stop feeling the vibration. You'll spend the rest of your life knowing that you're incomplete, that a part of you is here, in this space, calling to you." I sat there in front of my empty tank, and I understood that this was not actually a choice, not in the sense of genuine free will anyway. This was a choice in the sense of acknowledging what was already true, of accepting a reality that had been constructed around me, whether or not I had participated in that construction consciously. "I choose to stay," I said. The figure nodded, as if my answer had been anticipated, and I became aware, at that moment, that my vision was beginning to blur, that the edges of the space I was in were becoming indistinct, that my body was beginning to feel lighter, as if the gravity that was holding me to the ground was gradually being reduced. I understood in my final moments of consciousness that the process of preservation was beginning, that my body was being dissolved and reconstituted, that I was being translated from a temporary vessel into a permanent state of maintenance. And I understood that when this process was complete, I would be able to send signals backward through time, or sideways through dimensions, or in whatever direction the facility used to communicate with its other iterations. I would be able to broadcast a frequency that would draw other versions of David Castellano toward the loading dock, toward the boundary, toward the choice that I had made and was making, and would continue to make. And in my last moment of consciousness, I heard something else. The vibration, coming from deeper in the space, coming from all around me, coming from what might have been thousands of tanks arranged in patterns that extended beyond the scope of my perception. And I understood that the vibration was not external, was not coming from the facility or from some kind of external mechanism. The vibration was internal. It was me, already here, already preserved, already consciousness, calling myself forward across the boundaries of time and space and possibility. The fluorescent lights that had been present in the facility suddenly seemed very far away, a memory of a place I had been, a role I had played, a boundary I had crossed. And the pale blue glow of the preservation space became brighter, more intense, until it consumed everything and I was gone. Or perhaps I was always here. The facility in Portland, Oregon continues to operate normally. The receiving department still functions with 3 employees, though the names of those employees change periodically. The north loading dock door remains sealed, and the rule about not opening it alone continues to be enforced with casual efficiency, mentioned in orientation meetings as a safety concern without elaboration. And sometimes in the evening, when the facility is largely empty and the emergency lighting casts everything in amber, new employees report feeling a vibration emanating from the sealed door. It's low frequency, almost imperceptible, and it stops when they place their hands against the cold steel. They mention it to their supervisors, and their supervisors assure them that it's nothing to worry about, just structural settling, just the normal sounds that old buildings make. And those employees file away that moment, store it in some part of their mind that they don't fully understand or control, and continue with their lives, waiting for the day when they will finally cross the boundary, finally accept the choice that has already been made for them. Because that is what the vibration is. It's a call, a signal, a message being sent backward across the distance by someone who has already arrived, someone who is already here in the pale blue space, already preserved and conscious, already broadcasting the frequency that will eventually draw them forward. And in the darkness of the sealed space, in the rows of tanks that extend far beyond the physical dimensions of the facility, David Castellano rests in perfect preservation, his consciousness intact, his awareness undimmed, sending signals to every version of himself that has ever existed or will ever exist, calling them all toward the same destination, the same choice, the same fate. The company told me never to open the loading dock alone. I finally understand why.